Hi, Juliane. Thank you very much for joining me. And we've got a lot to talk about. But first of all, if you could just introduce yourself, and then I'll go to the first question.
Brilliant. So thank you, first of all, so much for having me. I'm Juliane Caillouette Noble, and I am the Managing Director of the Sustainable Restaurant Association.
Thank you. So my first question is, what is your purpose? What part of your job are you most passionate about, and what gets you up and fighting in the morning?
Oh,
And also just wrapped into that a little bit is um, give us a sort of brief rundown of how you ended up where you were and any particular kind of real light bulb moments or milestones you had along the way in that journey.
really good place to start. And I think that um, at the end of the day, food is what gets me up in the morning, and kind of a passion and a drive for really good food that then ultimately is just and is sustainably sourced and is respected and all of those things. And if I think about my career and how I ended up where I've ended up, I've got a kind of unlikely origin story in that my actual background in education was in education. And so I thought I was going to be a teacher or work in educational policy, and a real passion for learning and for children. And I got really sidetracked. I remember my kind of last year at university taking a course on urban education, and really sidetracked by this idea that how could we ever expect to fix the problems with our educational system if we have children who are hungry or who are being fed nutritionally empty food.
Mm-hmm.
Which of course then brings you back to the food system every time that you kind of scratch the surface on these issues around how our school food and feeding children is broken. That led me to work for Jamie Oliver and run school food programs for Jamie Oliver and develop food education resources for him on cooking and growing. And I think that especially that growing aspect and getting kids thinking about where their food comes from opens up the door to the fact that you can't really talk about human health without talking about the planet and the health of the planet. And all of that ends up coming back to where our, the soil and the farm and where our food comes from. And I think that's then what led me into sustainability as a career, ultimately landing me at the Sustainable Restaurant Association.
Amazing. So it sounds like that has all kind of led you back into an understanding of the importance of agroecology and actually that more nutrient dense food we need sort of I love the quote that we're overfed and undernourished in our society, and I think that we need to get more nutrients per calorie in whatever way we can, and less calories and in general. So that really kind of neatly brings me into my second question, which is, what does agroecology or regenerative sustainable farming look like to you? What's your vision of that, and what's your ideal? And also, how do you think that what we call quote unquote conventional farming can transition into that?
A really, really good question. And I think, so relevant at the moment, as it really seems like regenerative agriculture is becoming so much more mainstream and much more a part of a mainstream conversation. For me, if you kind of, go back to that story of understanding that human health and the health of the planet are interlinked, you see that most deeply, right, in this fact that our microbiomes and our system is deeply connected to the health of our soils, and that kind of making sure that we have that healthy diversity in our soil. And so when I think about what does that look like on farm, I'm really inspired by the work that people are doing in kind of biodynamic farming, in the work that people are doing to create mixed farming systems, where you are kind of integrating. I think we have had nearly a century of trying to separate out the production of our food and kind of isolate production into different regions, different parts of the world, different, not only just separate farms. And I think what we're starting to recognize now is actually all of these things work better when they're interconnected. And I think that it's really amazing to see that. You know, I get really inspired. Well, I think back to like how and where these light bulbs started for me. And I think back to, you know, the writing of Michael Pollan, or I was really inspired by Dan Barber's book, The Third Plate, and that really got me thinking about these things for the first time, and how, of course, obvious it is that the deliciousness of a food is also tied to the nutrient density of that food, is also tied to the production method of that food. And, you know, I think I very much experienced that, because when you're trying to get children interested in fruit and vegetables and in eating different things, there is such an obvious difference between giving them a really watered down, out of season, you know, tomato and telling them that they should be enjoying it, compared to a really beautifully grown, beautifully sourced in-season tomato. And so we're fighting an uphill battle when we're trying to say, kids, you need to eat your vegetables, but your vegetables taste like water. And, you know, and so I think that brings it all to life, and kind of, you know, I think restaurants then do the same thing, right? They then showcase the fact that that good food that is grown, you know, regeneratively, grown well, produced well, served in season, creates delicious meals.
Yep. No, I completely agree. One of the things that I've found though with you know, previous jobs I've had where I've worked in supplying things to restaurants is that I think restaurant chefs are very good at making mediocre ingredients taste an awful lot better. And you know, they know they use the same tricks in to some degree that the food industry uses, in that they, you know, sugar and salt and, you know, boosting umami and lots of butter and all the things that, you know, trigger the reward centers are being used, because I know that cost is a real issue for restaurants, and the margins are tight. So if they can buy a cheaper tomato that's a quarter of the price and put a bit of sugar and salt on before it's cooked, and it gives it that increase in mouthfeel, that, you know, that a lot of that tends to happen. So that's kind of brought me through to the next thing, is about transparency in food. And one of the problems I think the food chain has is that quite often there are quite a few nodes in the chain before the food gets to the between the farm and the plate. And one of the big problems is that I think a lot of the labeling is quite woolly. You mentioned tomatoes, and I think that's a great example. We recently wrote some posts about tomatoes and found that there can be almost 100-fold difference in impact of carbon between an organic tomato grown in soil under sunlight and one grown in a greenhouse that are still sometimes heated with fossil fuels. So my third question is, what can we do to move towards a greater transparency within the food system? Is there anything sort of technological or ideological that you know about, and what are you doing about that within your organization? How are you helping people make better decisions?
I think that's a really, really good point. And I think it's one that we actually spent quite a lot of time thinking about on the back of COVID. As the Sustainable Restaurant Association, the core thing that we do is provide restaurants with a framework for understanding sustainability. And that is divided into three key areas. We talk about sourcing, we talk about social impact, and we talk about environmental impact of the operations of the restaurant. And historically, one of the things that kind of started our sourcing section was a section on celebrating local and seasonal produce. And I think what we recognized over time is that there were some reverse incentives there, because by just limiting to talking about local and seasonal, even though the intention was good, and quite often that is the consumer messaging that you want to get across around shortening the supply chains and all of that, and having a deeper understanding. What we actually needed to be talking about with restaurants was transparency of your supply chain and provenance of your ingredients. And with that provenance, it needed to include production methods of those ingredients. And again, coming back to that tomato, like that's absolutely the perfect example that we then use to explain why we've made this transition in our accreditation, because you could have a British grown tomato. We don't have a climate that is well, it's getting more that way, isn't it, that it's becoming more naturally capable of supporting production of tomatoes, but we historically don't have a climate necessarily at scale that produces tomatoes, so we're ending up with these greenhouse grown, artificially heated, et cetera. And like you say, the impact is way higher than the impact of even if you took the food miles out, and you said that organically grown under sunlight is coming from Southern Italy, for example, or Northern Spain, or whatever it might be. I think we've grown up with this idea of understanding carbon in terms of food miles, but not really thinking about carbon in terms of production methods. And we need to start transitioning how we talk about that with both restaurants and with consumers to understand that a little bit more. I think in your question, you also were asking me around, how I think we fix this in terms of what does greater transparency look like. I think in our kind of field where we're talking to hospitality professionals, we're talking about chefs, we really need to unpick that level of transparency that restaurants have around their production, because a lot of we have become so kind of disconnected from farm level data that quite often restaurants are using suppliers up the supply chain, and you might have, in some instances, best case scenario country of origin data on your on your produce that you're hiring. So we really work with restaurants to say, okay, the first step is how do you get that transparency and traceability to say we know where that thing came from before you even do anything about setting policies to say, what your requirements are going to be of your suppliers. So that's step one. And I think in that you asked a little bit about technology or whatever that could be. I think better use of blockchain technologies in our supply chain is improving that traceability and that ability for us to see that where every batch of every one thing, even if it's getting consolidated, or you might see in dairy, for example, where you've got your milk coming from a bunch of co-ops that come into then one, Yo Valley works like that, right? And most kind of organic, even like organic high welfare farming at scale looks like that. It's a bunch of co-opted dairy farmers. And so I think blockchain technologies are allowing us to actually say, like, this is where that batch came from, or these are the farms that were involved. And I think that's exciting. And I think for restaurants, that can be possible to say, okay, these are the things we're sourcing. The first step is to understand where are they actually coming from, and to put that pressure on their suppliers and the ones that are delivering that food to give them that transparent information. That can be harder as a consumer, right? To navigate that. And I think that's where the messaging on consumer, like I do value that local sourcing message for consumers, because I do think that if we sort of are able to step outside of the supermarket universe that like we're so reliant on in this country, I'm from California. It's a place where we've got a lot of, specifically San Francisco, we've got a lot of farmers markets and a lot of real transparency at farm level that we're lacking in this country. Even in places where, even in rural areas where you're close to farms and stuff, we're sort of lacking that direct relationship. So as much as possible, encouraging consumers to get that information, to work with local businesses, because it's more likely that your greengrocer is going to have transparent data on where these things are coming from than you're going to be able to make sense of from the supermarket. And then I think that's where you get into a different conversation around what needs to happen at scale in the supermarket to change our behaviors, and not only at scale but also at pace, because we need to do these things at pace in order to create the food and farming system to feed the world into the future.
Oh my God, I completely agree wholeheartedly with everything you're saying. This is wonderful. Maybe we should try and get some controversy going, but I just think we agree on everything.
Yeah, exactly. Let's start disagreeing on some things.
I mean, I've talking about supermarkets is I reluctantly only visit them when I have to. If I've missed the farmers market, there's a couple of really good farmers markets near me where I can buy my veg, and I've become more aware of the dirty tricks that they play since doing these podcast interviews, and I'm never quite sure if what is grown in Britain in season, and you start looking at packets in supermarkets, and sometimes it'll say grown in UK, and then sometimes really, really tiny it'll say Peru or Kenya or something, and you've really got to look for it. But the other really interesting point that you made there was that there is a severe limitation between method of production and air miles, and if method of production can very easily out-trump air miles by many, many, many factors. So I struggle with the idea that local is always better if you don't know the method of production. If the method of production is equal, then local is better, but not always that. And that's a super, super important point. But you've kind of slightly
just to jump in really quickly on that point. I think in some ways the idea that kind of the confusion in consumers and that attachment to food miles is so strong in our minds, in some ways gives me hope, because that actually shows me that, because I think there was an education campaign in the kind of 90s, early 2000s around educating people on this idea of food miles. And it stuck and it works, and it's in our heads and our understanding of it. And I think actually that inspires me to say we are able to change these behaviors if we change the messages that we're giving kids, and if we change the things that we know, like reduce, reuse, recycle, right? Like it's so stuck in our minds. And to the fact that I was on a panel this week with Robin from Just Eat, and he was talking about how when they polled Just Eat users, 40% of them say that they want to be more sustainable and that they want Just Eat to help them make more sustainable choices. But only then when you delve into that, what's that?
Only 40%.
Well, 40% of the million users a day is actually like a good number, right? And
right. Okay. It's just slightly worrying that more than
I know
half
that it's not
care.
everyone. Yeah, sure. But when you delve into that, almost everyone thinks that the way that Just Eat could help them be more sustainable is to have more recyclable packaging. And we all know, as professionals working in this area, that the impact of the food is exponentially higher and more important
beyond the packaging
than the impact of the packaging, right?
Yeah.
But the consumer doesn't. The consumer's really fixated on plastic and packaging. And to me, again, it's another success of a message, of an educational campaign, because we were taught reduce, reuse, recycle is the thing we can do for the planet, right? And so now we go, okay, we can teach a whole society a bunch of messages. We just haven't done the right ones yet. And we need to shift those messages
onto method of production.
Yeah, not as sexy maybe as reduce, reuse, recycle. But there are some other things that we could be teaching about what those impacts actually are. Or it's been so drilled into us that the flights we take have a climate impact. And as we, are trying to be more climate conscious, that people should fly less. Our climate impact from personal travel, unless you're a billionaire flying on your private jet, is like an absolute fraction of the impact of your diet. And so, that those transitions are messages that we need to get across to people.
100% agree. And the other thing that the problem with all of this, of course, is that it is both complex and complicated, and there's a difference between those two things. But everybody likes a simple fix, and this is what I get. Obviously, what my previous job was, and I came across a lot of people assuming that everything plant-based was lower impact than anything animal-based in terms
Yes.
of foods, you know, and that was a real bugbear of mine, is that people like these sort of simple, quick, easy fixes. And in my opinion, the only way we can really boil that down and help the consumer is by having a lot more legislation around what the actual method of production was and what the impact of these different methods of production was. And the problem with this is, I'm sure you're aware of Hoare and Nemchek's paper that, you know, talked about there can be a 50-fold difference in impact of one food according to how it was produced. That is not represented in supermarkets. That is not represented on restaurant menus. And unless we're collecting considerably more farm data that is then staying with that item all the way through, like you said before, there's some amazing blockchain technology, which means you get an uneditable ledger that follows that ingredient all the way through of its life cycle. There's some fantastic companies, one called Agile Chain, which is which are doing things like giving more data that can go through different software systems, tagging to that product. So that one tomato in a restaurant, it could just be the chef is clicking 10 kilos tomatoes, British, deliver then, and that's it. That's the data you've got. Sometimes not even country of origin, you know, it's literally 10 kilos tomatoes. But what Agile Chain are doing is rewriting that so that it can be Lincolnshire polytunnel grown, not fossil fuel heated tomatoes, grown by X farmer. And that information can stay through all the different procurement softwares all the way through. And, you know, so it is a tech problem in some ways, but it's also a lack of data problem.
And I think one of the challenges that we have, right, is that we need to get this farm level data, and we need to do it without it becoming a burden on the farmer, because I think we have a real transition that needs to happen in our food system. But at the same time, because of the degradation of our soils, because of the industrialization of our food supply, all of these different things, farming is becoming an uneconomically viable industry in a lot of places and in a lot of ways, right? So farmers aren't in the position to be the ones to be making these investments themselves and to be responsible. And I think one of the fears that I have on the current environment that we're in is that everybody is kind of saying, we want supplier level data, we want producer level data, and everybody's asking for different things. And so, you know, what I would love to see, and I really love the work that you know, the Sustainable Food Trust is doing on the global farm metric, and I would like us to kind of coalesce globally around some of these metrics so that we aren't bogged down in asking a zillion different questions of a farmer to the point of them being confused, and that also that we don't let data or the lack of you know, the kind of imperfectness, I guess, of data stop us from at the same time making changes and improvements. Because sometimes you see that, particularly from big guys in the industry or in any industry, where you kind of go, well, I don't, you know, we need to delve into the data more, we need more before we can create an action plan. And I think it's really easy with climate, with food related, that to say that like it'll always be a bit imperfect, and we need to start acting before we can get to the bottom of it. Because if everybody creates a timeline to say we're going to give ourselves until 2030 to understand the data of our supply chains, we're not going to meet our climate goals.
Yeah, it's too late. It's too little, too late. I also am a great fan of the sort of pure pragmatism that the Global Farm Metric have applied to this problem, and it something you said there was really kind of resonated, is that it's. And what I like about what they're doing is they're saying, we'll just collect all the data and then leave it up to other organizations what bits of that data they want to look at. One of the problems that you identified there is that the farmers aren't really incentivized for collecting data. They're already stretched on time. They already find it enough difficulty. I really propose that it really should be down to the food industry, if we can cut even one node out of the supply chain, then there's money available to pay the farmers to collect data. And then it's easier to kind of, keep hold of that. It's the problem with the supermarket model, of course, is that very little of the final end price ends up back with the farmer. Another problem, I think, which has been highlighted, is that generally farmers have to pay to be accredited for doing less harm. And this seems like a sort of a backward way of doing things. And one of the aims of C.L.E.A.R, one of the things that's come up with the members of C.L.E.A.R is that we think farmers should have to pay to show the damage they're doing, and that the default position should be a perfect organic agroecological model. So if you buy a piece of broccoli in the supermarket that has no accreditations, it's the most perfectly grown agroecological piece of broccoli you can have, and that it should list the things that have been added that aren't that. So you should have to list pesticides, herbicides, artificial fertilizers, and that way around would definitely incentivize farmers towards more agroecological production. You've kind of answered this a bit, but in relation to your organization, what farm level data are you currently collecting, using, and how are you kind of trying to get more of it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So us ourselves don't have massive need for specific farm level data, right? We're not a food business that is sourcing. We're not farmers. We're not doing that work. And so we don't track individual farm level data in any capacity. What we are doing is asking restaurants to track. So we ask kind of that level of transparency matrix that I was talking about. Do you know country of origin? Do you know region of origin? Do you know farm? Do you know, and kind of getting down deeper and deeper into the transparency of your supply chain. And then we support restaurants with procurement templates. And we ask similar questions on production method. Then we go deeper on your kind of 10 most impactful items, so that the biggest purchases that you make. So if you're a burger restaurant or a steak restaurant, that's going to look different to if you're a fish and chip restaurant. And maybe the fish and chip, but it doesn't equate, because you might still serve meat because you have a battered sausage on the menu or something, but you sell tenfold fish compared to that piece of meat. So then we do that way with that, and then a bit of a deeper focus on particular high risk commodity items. So then you'll get a kind of deep dive into things like coffee and tea and chocolate and palm oil and other things like that. Where we'll ask some more specific questions around procurement standards and production methods and things like that. So it's not a matter of us ourselves holding any of this data. It's a matter of like putting onus on the restaurants to do that. And then we have while we don't go in and audit restaurants, we're not like standing there with a clipboard. We do have a robust evidence collection process with restaurants as they submit for food made good, where if you have told us that you have these agreements in place with your suppliers, then we need to see them. If you've told us that your meat is reared to organic standards, you need to show us those certifications. If it's not certified, but you're trying to show us that the practice is, maybe it is a biodynamic or regenerative farm, but they haven't paid for certification, then you need to show us proof from the farmer that, and things like that. Now, interestingly, that kind of links back to your other points around onus on the higher welfare or the like a better practices, as opposed to the responsibility on showing the damage that you're doing. I wholeheartedly agree with you, but I also think we have a sort of fundamental problem that we need to fix, which is that like we now have like nearly a century of this kind of muddying the waters of our food system, and kind of obscuring data from and kind of separating people from their food. And I think the hard thing is that when you do need to prove production method, like beneficial production methods to some extent, because otherwise it's ripe for abuse. And we live in a world that's not, we've kind of lost that trust on saying that, like, so that's why you almost need to prove purity more than you need to prove degradation. And I think you see that, another example of seeing where that has gone wrong and is problematic is in fishing as well. And but also we're sort of, as consumers, losing trust in certification methods as things, as there's more that's exposed. And I'm not entirely sure, like, that's helpful. I think we want consumers to feel trust in those things, and we need to acknowledge that, like, certification is imperfect, but there is some need for it, because we're sort of, this is the kind of nervousness around the word regenerative over the next 5 years, is you're seeing, there was at Sustainable Food London this week, there was a panel that was Nestle and John Lewis, Waitrose, and huge companies that were on a panel talking about regenerative farming. And I do deeply believe that a lot of these guys have, really, I have seen some of their strategies, some really great ambitions around, regenerative agriculture and their supply chains. But we need to be careful that regenerative farming doesn't become kind of a catch-all term that companies are able to manipulate to their own.
I think we're already there, and unfortunately, I think that ship has sailed. And I come across a lot of brands and saying, "Oh, we're doing regenerative now for particularly for arable crops. Oh, we're doing regenerative. We plant a cover crop and then we glyphosate it off." And I'm like, you're like nuking your soil, and you think that's regenerative because your soil carbon count has gone up, regardless of the you've just obliterated all the microbes in there. And I think because there is no strict legal definition of it, there are degrees of regenerative agriculture, and it's on a scale between that, which I think if you're using glyphosate, you don't have the right to use that word. Personal opinion, but I do think it's already been terribly abused. And the only thing to me that really means anything is organic. That's the only thing that is actually, you can go to prison if you misuse that term,
and that's because of the certification that's needed to get there. So it is that double-edged sword, right, where, like, we've built greater trust in organic because you have to prove it, though we all acknowledge that it sucks that the farmer is left with the onus of having to prove it. So it becomes that kind of complicated cycle. And I think that is something that we do need to unpick. And I think you just hit the nail on the head, which the fact is, like, it's only going to be unpicked via legislation and kind of legal definitions of these words, and therefore some sort of standard for certification, and ideally where the cost could be bared by the manufacturers, or the cost could be bared by the supermarkets or whatever, the big food conglomerates, as opposed to the cost bared by the farmer. Then we're in a better place.
100% agree. And this is really, we seem to be really neatly segueing into the next question here. That's the bonus of telling you what the questions were ahead of time. But food labeling. We just mentioned organic, and I think organic is the only one that really has robust meaning. And particularly, I think when you're in a supermarket, is that the supermarkets cannot get around that organic label. That's a legal definition. But there are many terms in the supermarket that are, I think, criminal in the way that they're used. And we've probably all got our own sort of personal bugbears. But one of them that really gets under my skin, which I'll just share with you and then ask you which yours are, is the use of the term free range, because it's almost meaningless, particularly in relation to poultry and eggs, which is where you most often see it. But yeah, what are yours? What are the biggest problems you think with food labeling in the UK, and how can we deal with them?
Natural. is another like one that kind of drives me crazy. I think you see artisanal in there too. Um and I know that the Real Bread campaign has done real work on kind of trying to create legal definitions of sourdough, um uh and I think that continues to be a problem, right?
Yeah,
In
they call it sourfaux.
yeah,
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 exactly.
yeah.
So I think those ones all they kind of bother me. I also think imagery on food packaging. So perhaps I mean an even bigger problem in the US where I'm from, but you get that kind of imagery of like barn and silo and like rolling hills and pastures on kind of any box of eggs, and or like on your package of cheese and things, and that is just like completely misleading to what the farming system looks like and the production method of those ingredients looks like. So I think that all bothers me.
Oh, and farm
Coming
brand
from
names as well.
what's
The other
that?
one, farm using turn
Oh
the
yeah, farm
supermarkets
fresh.
doing no using farm as brand names, so
Oh
making up
yeah,
fake farm names.
all
So
the fake farm names.
yeah,
Yeah,
they
absolutely.
make fake brands called like I don't know, Green Hills Farm, and it's
Yeah,
it's actually a brand
totally.
name for a product, and it's got no
Totally,
relation
and
to
not a
those.
farm. Yeah, that bothers me. I also remember, if I kind of go back to um the creation of the food education materials that we were doing, was the first time that I really delved in working with the nutrition team at Jamie Oliver on all of the legal definitions of like is a good source of, and all, for vitamins and minerals, and like when you're
That,
allowed to claim it front of
that's
pack.
quite robust, though. No, is that not quite
And
robust?
I mean, it is, but it's also I think a bit misleading on processed foods, because a lot of it then can be added, and so
Got you.
you get these kind of additives to products that aren't supposed to have those things in them,
The fortifications and things.
fortification stuff, and then you get these
Got
kind of
you.
is a good source. I think that obscures the idea that actually what's best for our diets is to eat fresh, non-processed foods.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that kind of disproportionately affects lower income households, because I think you end up with parents like trying to do the right thing by their kids, and they're looking for those products that say is a good source of, and of these things that they've been told, not realizing that like that broccoli that doesn't have a label on it is a better source of those ingredients than the cereal that has been fortified by it.
Yeah.
So that sort of is a bugbear for me. And there was one more that was just coming to mind, and I've forgotten it. No, I think those are all the sort of ones that bother me. And it just adds to like the idea too that this idea that like the products that are labeled and that are making these claims like often are so many steps removed down from
Yeah.
the food product themselves. They're in packages and they're processed and they're turned into something.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it sounds like you and I both kind of the main bugbear is the dirty tricks by the supermarkets, really, is kind of one of the things. And they do it because they can. That they're operating within the law. And I think that's what really irks me more than anything, is that they're not, they're not breaking the law. They're not doing illegal things. Otherwise, they would be stopped from doing those things.
Yeah.
And it's the lack of regulation around this that presumably is there's a lot of top-down pressure because of money that's creating the situation where they can do this. And it was really interesting hearing you talk about kind of lower income families, kind of, and I believe, as you do, that people generally want to do the right thing, especially when you're shopping for children.
100%.
And I get quite angry. I think that consumers are being very deliberately misled to the detriment of the health of their families.
Yeah.
That's
100%. And I think that's actually one of the things that I think broadened my focus a little bit more outside of I think when I came into the industry and was really focused on food, I think I was really taken by kind of obesity statistics, and I really did think that like we needed to teach more people how to cook, and that kind of individual responsibility argument a little bit, and though understanding that there was a kind of collective responsibility in the education system to help solve these problems. But I think the longer that I've been around, I think, you know, any sort of image that parents are feeding their kids junk food with the intention of their kids becoming overweight and having these diet-related diseases is a complete misunderstanding of like what's happening in our food system and why. And you know, I think there are many great campaigners out there that working in those issues around food poverty and around obesity levels. And you know, real shout out to friends over at Chefs in Schools and the work that they do with schools. And but I think, I think I fully believe, and I think it comes down, you know, beyond just parents and kids and consumer level, diners and restaurants, like people are trying to do the right thing generally. And often even in these companies, like even in the supermarkets, as I rail against them, like there are some really intelligent, really passionate, great people on the sustainability teams within a lot of these big organizations, right? We've just we've created a food system where now you're having to retrofit nearly a century of action of your business. And like, that's really hard to do unless there is some regulation intervention, because it's really hard to be a first mover, to take that financial hit, to do, you know, all of these things. Our system is not built to appreciate those moves by people. And so until we see a shift in the regulatory environment that favors that action, we'll start to unlock the pace at which this stuff needs to change.
Completely agree. And I would like to think that I don't think you can't change the system overnight. So I think it will be a snowball effect. I think it will be small changes that drive into competitive economic advantage that drive smaller changes, and the whole thing hopefully then will gather momentum. So we talked a lot about the problems within labeling and how they might be solved by small incremental changes that could build into bigger changes over time. My final question, what is your vision for the future of food and farming? And I'm hoping you're going to give me the utopian rather than the dystopian, but if you have a dystopian view of our future, then please let me have it. It's an open question. What is your vision?
It's a nice small question to end our conversation on.
Sorry.
No, I always come back to a positive view of the future. You know, I think there is a dystopian view, or like, you know, if you believe kind of what Silicon Valley wants to push on this idea that we might all be drinking Huel and like wearing, you know, living in the metaverse. And I went to a conference where someone was trying to show this restaurant concept around glasses, 3D glasses and metaverse, and then you took kind of pills to taste like different flavors. And there's nothing more depressing to me than that sort of idea of the future. And I think that if we don't set up a positive case scenario, people don't take action. I think that if you feel like the problem, and I think this is one of our issues in terms of messaging on climate, and you're starting to see kind of the evidence base for this, which is that, you know, the more that we reinforce negative scenarios and perspectives of kind of the doom of the climate, people feel that the challenge is too insurmountable to do anything about. And the reality is we need everyone to do something. And, you know, I look at Alice Waters when she was kind of a revolutionary in the 70s in California and in kind of farming and restaurants, and then eventually went on to open the Edible Schoolyard. One of Alice's famous quote, well, she's got two really relevant famous quotes. One is that the revolution will be delicious, and that the only way that we can transform the food system into the one that we need to do or need to create is to constantly go back to that deliciousness of food. And that's where our conversation started, with this idea that food that is grown well, that is nutrient dense and has good provenance, tastes better than food that doesn't. And if we can kind of really get back to reincorporating that, then I think we're in a really good place. And the second thing that she talks about, particularly with the edible schoolyard, is that you need to build models that people can walk into. And so instead of sitting around and talking about how the food system needs to change, I'm incredibly inspired by the amount of people that are out there farming differently and that are out there showing. And then you see this with restaurants too, the amount of chefs that are sourcing differently, that are thinking differently about what those menus could look like. And I think that's everything from, we've got an abundance of beautiful, market garden led restaurants up and down this country that are doing some really amazing things with growing their own food, with creating these really short, transparent supply chains, and supporting really great producers. I think you see that in small pub groups like the Culpeper group that have now started biodynamically farming on a piece of land in Deptford, and they're trying to learn along the way around what, obviously that doesn't supply their whole restaurant operation, but, over time, how much of it can it, and how does that become an economically viable model? So there's a model there, but I think you also can see that at scale in some interesting things that businesses are doing. So, Oaxaca is an example that I use a lot because I think that, Tommy's an inspiration, I think, and Mark, and the way that they've set up that business. But I also think that they've been really, really considered around where, how that menu is set up. So it's kind of 50-60% veg led, and important to say veg-led and not plant-based, because we're talking about actual vegetables and legumes and beans and all of these things. And then as they started to really talk about that, they have an awareness of their carbon impact, and they're interested in reducing their carbon footprint, but not to the detriment of kind of separating food and farming and production. And so they recently changed their menu, where they took the steak taco off the menu, but they intentionally did not leave beef off the menu. So they instead changed it to being a braised beef taco. And what that does is allow them to buy offcuts of meat. And they now are really focused on this idea of kind of carcass balance, and ensuring that that we're creating better carcass balancing in our meat production system. And that if you have, a good, well-sourced, regenerative, beef plays and kind of grazing animals play a really important role in these farming systems that we're talking about. So, I think that's a really interesting one. And in some ways, like, the customer at Oaxaca doesn't even really need to know that, or doesn't know the difference really that they swap, but it's a huge meaningful swap if you look at the impact on the system. So I think we see some really inspiring places, some really inspiring ideas that can give us a perspective on what the future could look like. I think that the future needs to continue to have restaurants, because I think that restaurants play a really important role in not just feeding people, but in our cities and in our culture and in connecting people and in all these greater things. And I think in some ways we want to return to that dialogue of meaningfulness of our restaurant spaces and our cities and our cultures and all that sort of stuff, and move away from the kind of only growth potential being convenience in our food system. So yeah, and I think, I'm going to give another shout out to the Sustainable Food Trust, but I think their kind of Feeding Britain report is a really interesting one. If you look at how our farming, I was with Patrick at an event yesterday, and he was talking about how it's all, we can sit and intellectually talk about the food system, but like, if that's not what our land is able
Yeah.
to produce, or we need to start there. Like, what is able to be produced on our land? How should we be able, what does it call for? How can we farm it? Then
Yeah.
we can build a food system up from there. And I think they've given a pretty clear prescription of what a food system in England could look like, and how that means integrating our farming and moving and not isolating grazing cattle to one part of the country and and kind of pigs and poultry to another part of the country, and arable elsewhere, and starting to look at what those mixed farming systems need to look like and how that can support. And I think bringing food into cities a little bit more. And so what does that look like? And I think schools are an interesting vehicle for that. If more schools have market gardens, and if we kind of go back to these community-based agriculture programs. And I think, there's some really inspiring stuff. Growing Communities does really great, inspiring work in that space. And yeah, I think we need to scale up a lot of these ideas, because I think we've got some really good models in order to see a food system that works for the future.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I completely agree. When you were talking, I was trying to work out if there's an overarching theme in there. And I think it is just simply connecting back to nature and realizing that we are part of nature, and getting back to that point of, I really enjoyed it hearing that food pleasure is such an important driver. And really, I completely agree. I think that can be the most important driver to getting us towards more agroecological food systems.
Yeah.
But Juliane, we've been going for way longer than we should have done. For this,
thank you so much, Glenn. I really appreciate
time. A new short form-ish, and it hasn't been at all. But I think we probably could have gone on all afternoon. But
definitely.
Thank you
find some more time to connect and keep talking.
Thank you. I absolutely will do.